Hey, how's it going? Y'all ready to talk about some mastering? I'm uh I'm here at Hacienda as usual. I'm joined today by Mitty. Say hello, Mitty. Mitty is a cat of few words. But anyway, I thought before I get any further into this series, it might be good if I sort of broke down my Reaper build that I use for mastering, and kind of show you how my process works, so that, when I do show you things, you have some context to refer against, so that things make more sense. All right. So let's take it like right from the tippy top. And that begins with me making a job folder for whatever the song is, or EP or LP I'm going to master, right? So I duplicate my session template. I give it a job number, and I give it a name, artist name, song title, remixer. All right. So now within this template folder, I've got a couple things. I've got my Reaper file that I start with. I copy the job name into that so that it's cooked into the Reaper file. And I've got three folders. First one's masters. Well, actually, the first one's original sources. This is where the mixes I download go from the client, right? And then I have a sample rate conversion folder, which is where my resamples go. Like, I like to work at 48K for digital masters. If people send me 44.1, I just upsample it to 48K. And I like doing that because I send deliverables out at 48K for like video, for sync licensing, and for, platforms like SoundCloud and, Meta platforms and whatnot. I find that they resample nicer, as 48K uploads, just a little nicer because that's what they play back at on most of these platforms, right? Now, if I'm working on a vinyl pre-master, I'll upsample to 96K because that's what, cutting houses like to receive, for pre-masters, right? So then the third folder is my masters folder. And inside of this, I have my four most common deliverables that I send out as boilerplate to everybody. 320 MP3, standard. If people are shopping their tracks out for labels, a lot of labels won't even listen to your demo if it comes in as a WAV file because they don't want to download such a big file and have to deal with that. So I send those out as a matter of cause. 1644 distro, if it's for a client who is serving like Beatport and Juno and all of the, DJ retail platforms, I tend to still send 1644. If it isn't destined for those platforms, I send out 2444 wave, because I find that 24-bit uploads just tend to lossy encode a little cleaner than 16-bit. And then I do 2444 AIFF Bandcamp deliverables, because if any of you have mastered for club music before that went to Bandcamp, you've probably tried uploading 24-bit WAV files and had them break in CDJs when you try and load them. That's a known problem on Bandcamp's upload end. They flip this flag in the WAV metadata, in the header bit, that turns on multi-channel, which freaks CDJs out, and they just throw an error and won't play them. So the way around that, so that I can still, have 24-bit master files being converted into the lossy files for like MP3 downloads, I send AIFFs at 24-bit. And then lastly, 2448. For anybody who's like syncing their stuff out, they're probably going to want 2448. If stuff's going to a video editor, And also just like uploading to SoundCloud. Again, I find that 24-bit master files lossy encode a little cleaner. So I try and do that everywhere that I can. All right. So that's enough about that. Let's crack into this Reaper file here so I can show you what my template looks like. Okay, so here we are. I've got a session. I have 7 source channels. These are where I load the mixes to. And in the case of stem mastering, I have a boilerplate 7 stem breakdown that I like to work from. So I have 7 source channels so that I can just drop them right in there and I'm ready to go. I don't have to, duplicate channels or any of that nonsense. I'm just ready to go, right? So those 7 source channels then drop into a submix aux, which sums them together. And then it can send out to my D to A converters for my pitch path to the hardware and bring it back in. And then that goes into the prelim channel where all of my post analog effects are applied, whether that's clippers, limiters, whatever it needs to get it done, right? And then after that, it drops into a post-lim channel, which is where I print the master, okay? And let's go through the load-in process real quick. So I've got a Stream Deck here that does a lot of things for me. One of those things is it launches a script when I hit it that opens the file browser to import whatever mix I want to bring in, or stems or whatever. All right, so let's bring in this one. Okay, now this does a couple things, and I'll go through what they are. The first thing it does, obviously, is it brings the mix in to this source channel that I had in focus when I launched the import dialog, right? Pretty simple. Second thing it does is it copies that mix into this mix path as well. Now, the purpose of this mix path is so that I have just the mix available that I can send out from a different output from the DAW than my master output. And my master output goes into one source on my monitor controller, and the mix goes into another source on my monitor controller. And the way I designed my monitor controller, I'm able to apply gain offsets so that I could turn the mix up compared to the master, right? And that's really important because that lets me listen to the mix and compare it to the master at equal playback level with the master, even though I've done a bunch of, whatever, compression, limiting, clipping, dynamic control on the master. I can still play that mix back as loud perceptually as the master. And it's really critical if you're doing mastering that you are able to do that. Because like I said in the previous video, if you aren't listening to, if you're not A/Bing with equal loudness playback between both options, you're inherently biasing yourself. We are wired up to prefer the louder of two similar versions of something. It's intrinsic to our nature. And without being able to level the playing field in terms of perceptual level, you're sunk. You're going to be biased towards the louder of the two, and it's going to make your job more difficult. And you're not going to be listening to the flaws in your master as closely as you would be able to if you could listen to it next to the mix at equal playback level, because you'll be so biased by how much louder it is and how much bigger it sounds that you're not going to hear, oh, I flattened the kick drum, or ooh, the snare's getting a little edgy and distorted, or whatever it may be. Oh, the vocal is a little bit strident, or whatever. So that's why this mix path exists. And that's why I have gain offsets on my monitor controller. So I also have a reference path down here as well. And that lets me do things like bring the artist's self-master in, maybe bring in a lossless version of a reference song they want me to compare against. Because again, I can listen to it at equal level if I want to, or I could, have it at unity gain so that I can be comparing the loudness of what I've got going versus what they're shooting for, and so on and so forth. Sometimes if I'm doing a revision of a master, I'll move the last version of the master into the reference path so I can reference against it to make sure that, the changes I'm making are in line with the client's preference. It's really handy. It's really good to have at least 2 or 3 alternate, playback paths that you can gain offset against what you're working on. Keeps you really objective. It makes you work faster. It's good stuff. I highly recommend it, right? So now I brought in a single here, one song, and the third thing that my import script did, other than bringing the mix into the source, bringing it into the mix path, is it dropped what's called a region up here. Now, regions are a means for separating different events in Reaper, and you can do a variety of things with them. In the way that I have Reaper set up, in my render dialog where I spit out my masters at the end, I have it make a master file, a wave file for each region. And the length of that wave file and the bounds of that wave file are defined by the bounds of the region. And also the name of that wave file is generated from the name of the region, and it's augmented by some syntax that I add to distinguish the different deliverable versions, whether it's like a 2448 or a 1644, and what those represent in simple terms. Distribution, video, same naming convention as in my master folders, okay? So let's name this thing. All right, and I put my little master version in there because that also gets cooked into the name so that I know which version of the master is which file on the disk. Okay, so we're all good on that now. And depending on the album, I may name the SRC'd mixes before I even import them into here, because then everything is automated. And bear in mind, I've only brought one song in here, but I could bring, a whole LP of songs in here, and it would automatically split them up into different regions so that, their bounds are defined and they're named and they're all ready to go and they're in the right order if I put, numbers in front of the names of the files. It really automates a pretty, clunky part of the process where you usually bring an assistant in. When me and Sean developed this script, I lovingly titled it the Assistant Killer because it basically does your whole load in for you with one keystroke, which is pretty cool. That's the sort of thing that Reaper's really good for, is you can just have it automate really annoying stuff that would just take forever to do. As long as you can break it down into a series of simple actions. Every action you can possibly think of is accounted for in the actions list for this program. Between that and the SWS extension pack, pretty much everything I've ever looked for as an action has been available to me in it. Okay, so now we're ready to start our treatment on this. So like I said in the last video, we can do things with this audio take that's here. We can cut it up by section, we can, I don't know, separate the breakdowns from the main passages. I can tab to transient like you can in Pro Tools. And then I can do a variety of things with these sections that I've divided up here, right? Like, for instance, say I want to put, multiplicity on just this part of the mix, right? I hit a button on my Stream Deck, and it pulls up multiplicity on that part of the take because that's what was in focus when I pushed the button to launch it. It launches with my starting settings for this plugin. Let's suppose I would rather, I want to put, equilibrium. I'm on a DMG kick. I want to put equilibrium on the whole channel now, where it's applied to the entire mix throughout. I just select the channel, I hit my button for it, and voila, it launches equilibrium on the channel. Now this plugin gets applied to the whole song, okay? And it's got my starting settings that I like, and I'm good to go on that. All right. And I can do all sorts of things like conducting, where I pull the level down of maybe the breakdowns to compensate for clipping and limiting level that gets added to sections that aren't being loaded by bass. Things of that nature, like I got into. So I have two avenues of applying processing here. I can apply it on the take with object effects. I can apply it on the channel. Okay. And as you can see, I have a send from here into the submix. And that's the case with all of these channels here. Now, I guess let's talk about this submix for a little bit. I've got some things going on here. And again, the purpose of this is to sum all of my sources. And then after I sum them, I have a couple options. If I hit Control-I, it turns this RIA insert on. Now, what RIA insert is a plugin that comes with Reaper that allows you to send audio out of an output and bring it back in on an input. And it allows you to apply delay compensation for the time of flight, through your digital ecosystem, through your D to A converters, through your A to D converters, and back into the DAW. And what that permits is monitoring your plugins that are pre-analog without them having latency on their visual displays and what have you. I didn't really care about that very much until I started doing these videos, and now I figure it's valuable to y'all for, these plugins to not be delayed by some amount of time, which they're delayed by a lot because I have like finite impulse response filters going for crossovers on some of my plugins and on some of my EQs. I have plugins that have a lot of latency that's incurred. So I incorporated this as opposed to doing a simple output from the submix to the hardware and then an input into the prelim record input like I had been doing before, right? So anyway, Control-I toggles that D to A and A to D path through the RME, ADI2 Pro FSR Black Edition converters. Really rolls off the tongue, right? I love RME. I can't say a single bad thing about them. Okay, so now if I hit Alt-I, it toggles in this RIA insert, which says Lavry. I'm sure you're intrigued already. Now this one still goes out of the RME D to A's because I don't own a Lavry Quintessence yet. But now that I got this Mark III, second I got $8,600 in my pocket, that thing is going to be headed my way, straight in the rack. I got a taste of the Lavry sound. I want to own everything they own. I'm going to be a full kit wanker with Lavry stuff. Got to have the full pitch and catch path. I just have to financially recover from the Mark III first, right? So anyway, the Lavry RIA insert goes out of the RME D to A's, but comes back in through the Lavry A to D, right? And you'll notice on both of these, I have a 0.2 dB gain increase on the return volume. Now, the reason I'm doing that is to compensate for insertion loss through my transfer console. It loses about 0.2 dB of level through that path. And, you know, having this hotkey makes it really easy for me to toggle the conversion path in and out so I can compare to full digital versus, you know, going analog and coming back in, so I can hear if I'm losing anything that I'm going to miss, right? Again, it keeps you objective. It makes it very easy to A/B between those things, and I won't be biased by the loss of 0.2 dB of level, because before I figured it out, it was biasing me, and you wouldn't think 0.2 dB would be enough to make you think less of one option versus another, but it can. It really, when you're listening for something as minute as insertion loss from top flight converters, it can bias you. So that's why I compensate for that. Okay. Not like I got to do a lot of compensating for the Lavry path, because I don't think I've printed a single master through that thing that's been below full scale. I'm compensating the hell out of that insertion loss. Beautiful clipping device. And yeah, speaking of clipping, there's one other thing I should probably mention. I have another fancy button here that I can apply to any take that's highlighted with my Stream Deck, and it normalizes to -3 dBFS. And that puts me in a range that I like to be in, where I've got enough wiggle room to be able to do a little finessing in the box before I go out into analog. And it gives me a little bit of wiggle room to be able to compensate and equal loudness compare the impact of clipping through the Lavry. And how do I do that, you're probably wondering. Well, you notice these volume adjustment plugins here. These are another stock Reaper plugin. Comes with the program. And I have one before the analog transfer, and I have one after the analog transfer. And through the use of parameter links between these plugins, I have them set up so that if I turn this one's volume adjustment up, it makes this one's volume adjustment go down. So I can turn the level up going out to analog, and it automatically turns the level down of what comes back in to compensate for that. And that lets me adjust the amount of clipping I'm doing through the Lavry while listening to it at equal playback level. And it's really important that you do that, regardless of whether you're using, you know, a hardware clipping scenario like me, or if you're doing plug-in clippers. A lot of plug-in clippers have a input-output link that'll automatically do this on your behalf, so that when you turn the level up and clip harder through the clipper, it automatically turns your output down. And that way you're not listening to just the improvement in terms of, perceptual loudness, you're also hearing the deleterious effects of that clipping. Because without that, and especially if you don't have a super great handle on what clipping does to a signal, or if you have lousy monitoring and a worse room, this will make the impact of that clipping more revealing, the negative impacts of that clipping. And that will keep you honest with yourself and with your client, keep you objective so that you're doing the best work you can, right? So I'm gain staged to -3 dBFS here, my peak level for this mix. I'm going to dial in 5.5 dB of output gain from my transfer console. So we're hitting the D to A's at 18 plus 18 dBu, and we're going to be coming into the Lavry at plus 23.5 dBu. So we're going to be clipping it. I have wiggle room though before the mix starts clipping out of my D to A, thanks to the -3 dBFS normalization I did with the mix. Hopefully you're following this, because you don't want to clip on the way out of the D to A. That isn't where the magic lives. The magic lives in clipping the A to D, coming back in, right? So let's have a listen to this, and let's have a listen to it. It probably won't be clipping very much when I hit play, but then I'm going to turn this adjustment up and have a listen to what it does. Oops. It would probably help if I had the Lavry in circuit, hey? Okay, let's try that again. Oh, and this little red flickering light is the clip indicator on the Lavry, just so you can track how much clipping I'm doing here, okay? It's just barely flickering. I'm going to turn it down a little more just so that we're starting from a place of no clipping to compare in a more fair way. And by the way, this is the Mercury remix of Serpentine by David Starfire. Alec was kind enough to give me permission to show y'all some stuff with this mix. Thank you, Alec. I love you. You're my favorite client. That's not true. I got a ton of favorite clients, but I love you. Okay. So I'm going to turn it up. Compare that to this. Back up again. So to my ear, we're losing a little bit of bottom octave, and we're losing some punch on the kick drum. All right. Let me be a smart boy and kick this limiter in real quick, just so that I'm not clipping my output and making this sound god-awful for y'all. Okay, now, had I not had this, inverted gain strategy going on here where I can compare the clipping at equal playback level, I may have not noticed that we were losing power in the kick and that we're losing sub-range, right? Because I would be so biased by it being 5.5 dB louder all of a sudden that maybe I wouldn't have noticed that, and maybe you wouldn't have either, right? But you see how much more analytical this is when you take that factor out of the equation entirely and you're just listening to the impact of the clipping? Getting perceptual level out of your listening path will really open doors in terms of how objective you can be. I can't stress it enough. It's critical. Okay. So, like I said, we're losing some power in the low end here. And this is common in bass music, especially, and a lot of club music, because we, by the terms of the rest of the mastering community, are pretty far out of spec for sub-level versus the rest of the, spectral content of a master. We put a shit ton of bass in our masters, right? So, that's what you lose first in clipping and in limiting too. It flattens it out because it's the loudest signal and it's the thing that hits it hardest. So that brings me to another thing that is in my submix, and that is a pair of equilibriums on either side of my analog path. And I have these configured such that if I turn the bass down, if I turn this shelf down, it turns this one up so that I can turn the bass down going into the analog path. And then when it comes back into the digital world, it adds that bass back in. I got this trick from my buddy, Mr. Bill, and he didn't invent this concept by any means, even though he's a genius and he's invented tons of concepts. This is common to a lot of things, one of which is the RIAA filters that are used in vinyl manufacture. They de-emphasize the bass in the cut, and then the preamps that the turntable hooks into adds that bass back so that you can put more bass in a vinyl cut without the groove skipping. Right? This is similar. We're taking some of the level of that bass down. It's still there. We're just attenuating it. Clipping with less bass present. And then when we get back into the digital world, we add it back so that the tone hasn't changed. The only thing that's changed is the amount of clipping that's being applied to the bass range. And if you do bass music, if you do club music of any sort, if you do hip hop, if you do R&B, anything that's bass intensive, this is a great trick for your clipping life. All right. Let's have a listen to it, shall we? And I have the cutoff frequency also ganged between this. I have the Q factor of this band linked between them. So anything I do here is mirrored between these two, okay? So I'm going to start with it flat, and I'm going to turn this down and listen to what happens to the bass and sub range here. Without, and there's with. Without, and with. You hear that sub blooming when I kick the de-emphasis and re-emphasis filters in, and the kick gets some of its punch back. It's a nice trick. It really works sometimes. Now, you got to use it in moderation. You want to apply a certain degree of clipping to your bass because you want it to be inflated and you want your kick to be inflated, by the same proportion that's happening to the rest of the frequency content, right? Because, when it hits that kick drum, it adds a certain niceness to it. It adds harmonic overtones to that kick drum that while it's taking power away in the sub range, it adds perceptual level in its overtone series, right? So you want a certain amount of clipping on your bass. It's just a matter of dialing in just the right amount of it to where it's got the right amount of dynamic left, and you're not eroding, your sub level too much with excessive clipping applied to it. It's a nice way to clean up the sound of your kick and bass through a clipper, where otherwise it would get distorted and gross and flat and wimpy in the mix, okay? This is a nice trick. You should keep this in your back pocket. Now, if you're a Reaper user, the way that I created this parameter link between these two plugins is I just went to this parameter button on the one that I want to be slaved to the one that I'm controlling. And I go to parameter modulation link, and you'll see that I have a couple check marks next to these. I'll take gain, for instance. What I've got going on here is I have the gain of this equilibrium instance linked to the gain of this equilibrium instance. And they're inversely scaled so that when I turn this one down, the other one comes up, and vice versa. And then I just have the baseline set up here so that when they're zeroed out, they're both zeroed out, right? And then similarly for volume adjustment, I did exactly the same thing. I went to the parameter of the one that I want to slave to the one that I'm controlling, and I do adjustment. And again, I set my baseline up here. I set the link to this first volume adjustment, and I inversely scale it. Okay? Now, one other point of information if you're a Reaper user. This JS volume adjustment plugin that comes with Reaper, it defaults to an adjustment range of 150 dB by default, where basically if you touch this fader, you've blown your speakers out, right? I like my speakers. I didn't want to do that to myself, and I didn't want to have to get like super touchy adjusting this fader. So I went into the source code for it by hitting the edit button here, which you can do with all of the Reaper plugins. You can just go in and change the way that their plugins work if you don't like the way they work by default, which is just so neat. And I took this slider 1 adjustment, and I changed the range from negative 150 to 150, and changed it to negative 5.5 to 5.5, because that was a good range that I felt represented the amount of swing I would need in most clipping cases, because I can bias it further by turning up the gain out on my transfer console if I need a little more pepper on it. I've got 11 dB of gain I can add here, so I don't need a ton of it on that adjustment. So that's the range I went with, but you're welcome to put whatever amount of range you want on it. Now, just to make this a little more quick and ergonomic for me while I'm working, I right-clicked on this volume adjustment, and I did Show FX Parameters in Panel and selected Adjustment. And what that lets you do is add this adjustment fader right on the channel screen, so that I don't even have to open this plugin to adjust the fader. I can just do it right from the channel, which is so nice. It's just one of the little nice things you can do in Reaper that just makes your process more ergonomic and quicker and just lovely. All right, so that's what I got going on in my submix. My two converter options, my de-emphasis, re-emphasis filters, and my pre-insert, post-insert gain compensation. All right, so from there, we send the output of the submix into my prelim channel. Now, this is where I can apply my post analog plugins, which usually are, clipping. Well, used to be clipping before I got the Mark III. I haven't touched my in-the-box clippers much other than to shoot them out and then wind up going with the Mark III. I don't know how much longer I'm going to do that for because I prefer it pretty much every time, but I digress. This is not the clipping video. We'll get into that. So my clippers, and you'll notice I have the same de-emphasis, re-emphasis filters on those clippers as well. Same exact deal as on my analog path, but for my in-the-box clippers. And then I've got the 2 clippers I use most often. And then I've got my 4 most often used limiters. All right. And, I've got some hotkeys. I can use C to switch between gold clip and ash, or whichever 2 clippers I have loaded into these slots. And then I've got my 4 limiters here, and I've got some hotkeys for that too. L switches between limiter 1 and limiter 2. Shift L switches between limiter 2 and limiter 3. And Alt L switches between limiter 3 and limiter 4. Now what this lets me do is set up different combinations of limiters and shoot them out against each other real fast as I'm playing music through. I just set the same settings in different limiters and I try out different combinations. I'm a big proponent of splitting the work so far as dynamics are concerned. I like to chip away at the dynamics of a mix from a bunch of different angles because I think the less you attack the signal from one angle, the less audible the distortion will be, the less hard your dynamic processors will have to work, and the cleaner of an outcome you'll wind up with. You might say that's bro science, but I don't know. It's worked out pretty well for me so far, So sometimes I do 2 limiters. Sometimes I do 2 clippers. I also like throwing in some combination of single band downward compression, multi-band downward compression, multi-band upward compression, and then clipping and limiting. Just working on the bottom of the signal in the case of parallel compression, working on, the top of the signal with time constants in the form of compression, downward compression, working on the top of the signal with limiters, and working on the top of the signal without time constants in the form of clipping. Okay? So, that's my prelim. And then after all my processing is applied, I drop it out of the prelim via ascend and into the postlim. And this is where the master wave file is actually recorded. I really like printing my masters in real time. Regardless of if I'm in the box or out of the box, I like hearing the exact print that's going to come out of this thing because it lets me QC while I create the master. I don't have to go after I've exported my master through all the processing and, listen to it in RX or whatever. I can just listen to the print, and I subscribe to the, one QC to rule them all, where I QC the master print, and then all of the resampled deliverables will be QC'd as a consequence of that. That's how I work. That's how my mentor works. So yeah, And then after that, once I have, the final master printed, how do I want to do this? Let's just, I don't know, copy this and paste it into the post lim here. We'll pretend this is my master, okay? Once I print my master, I go through and I top and tail it. Topping and tailing is where you set where the beginning of the wave, the master, starts and where it ends, okay? For my top, I stick to a convention of 10 SMPTE frames prior to the first audible moment at like a negative 60 dB threshold of the song. And I have another button here that tabs to transient at negative 60 and then backs up 10 SMPTE frames and leaves the playhead there. So I hit my button and voila, we now have 10 SMPTE frames of space cooked in here. And then I turn snap to grid on and I drag the beginning of my region back. And here we are. The song's top has been set. Then I go to the end of my master, and most of the time you wind up with a mix where they either have a tail on it that's, way longer than they intend for the end of the song. Sometimes they don't, but usually they do. And it's usually pretty self-evident from looking at it and listening to it. Or they send you a bounce where the reverb tail at the end gets truncated at the end. That's my favorite. So after I print my master, obviously the dynamic has come up. So even if, the reverb tail sounded pretty good and faded to what sounded like digital black at the end of their bounce, it doesn't after you run it through all your dynamic processing, right? So last thing I do there is I'll add a little fade as needed, okay? So that defines the end of the bounce, right? You following so far? There's going to be a quiz on this at the end. So once I got this topped and tailed, ready to go, I go to my bounce dialog. Now, in my bounce dialog, I have a series of presets that I've created for different deliverable versions. 1644 wave, 2444 AIFF, 2444 wave, 2448 wave, and 320 MP3. And I have both a single Gesundheit MIDI. I have both a single version, which is denoted with an S, and I have an album version. And the difference between these two is the single version for these drops it into the masters folder for whatever job folder I have the session in, right? But if I'm doing album version, it drops it into the 1644 distribution folder, okay? So that, if I'm bouncing out an album, I automatically have it put the right deliverables in the right deliverable folders. But if I'm bouncing out a single where it's just one song, I have it bounce all my deliverables into the root of the master folder so that I can just zip them and upload them right away. I don't have to go fish through my deliverable folders and aggregate them together and then zip them. It saves me a step, right? So, suffice it to say, I do my sample rate conversion on my deliverables in Reaper. I used to use RX for that, but then I had a little comparison session of RX's SRC to the rate brain SRC that's built into Reaper as an option. And the rate brain SRC, according to Infinite Wave, is the one to beat right now. It has the cleanest transfer with the least amount of aliasing and artifacts and all that good shit. So I wound up kicking RX out and just generating all of my deliverables in here. And the really cool thing about doing that in here, on top of it being better by some alleged degree, is that I can say, okay, I want my 1644 deliverables for this song, or if there's a series of songs in an EP or an LP here, I can have it separate each region into a separate file, and it names it region, and then the name of that deliverable, put it in the right folder, I add it to my render queue, and then I go to the next deliverable I want for that file or series of files, add that to the render queue, add my next one, add that to the render queue, and so on and so forth until they're all added. None of them have been added because I haven't actually selected the region to be exported. That was a real rookie move. Let me do this again real quick. 2448, 1644, you get the idea. And then when I'm done, I pull up this render queue here. And what this does is it renders out each deliverable or each set of deliverables, depending on how many songs are in the session that I'm choosing to export. And it's not just limited to this session. This is a global render queue. So supposing I wanted to work less linearly and do a bunch of mastering sessions and then render out all of my deliverables at the end of the day, I can be adding versions to this render queue across multiple sessions all day. And then at the end of my day, I can just render out all of the deliverables from every session with one button press. It automatically loads the sessions and spits out each set of deliverables. How cool is that? Like, not only does it queue your exports, but it can do it across the whole, like any session on your computer with one keystroke. You get the impression of how powerful of a DAW this is? Like, this is stuff that's just built into the base program. I haven't even gotten into the stuff you can do with extension suites that you can add to Reaper's base build. Like, this is crazy. This shit is crazy to me. Like, it's so good. It just embarrasses every other DAW, especially for people mastering. Like, it's like they built a DAW that could be turned into the ultimate mastering DAW. So that is a lot of the functionality of my mastering DAW here. Let's go into a couple use cases where I've already got stuff going here, okay? So this is the finished version of the song that I loaded in here, okay? And there's not really a lot to talk about. As you can see, I've got plugins going on the takes. I got take effects going, and I've got plugins going on the channel. I've got my Lavry inserted. I was naughty and I didn't use my equal loudness compensation for the clipping. Naughty. And then I've got Elevate on it on the way out. Now let's talk about my input monitoring for comparing what's actively being played back through the plugins, through the desk, through the limiter, and comparing that to what I've already got printed to track here. Okay, I'm going to start without recall done on this, and then I'll add recall afterwards so that I can prove to you that it's different, right? So if I hit M, it switches between my input monitoring mode, where I'm listening to the live audio through my settings, or I can listen to the capture that's printed to the post lim. Okay? Because, once I have something printed, I don't also want to be listening to the live audio at the same time, because then I'm not listening to the capture. I'm listening to a big mess that's coming out at plus 6 dB and sounds terrible, right? Now, you're probably wondering, well, Matt, why don't you just use the input monitoring that's on the post lim channel? Well, you see, you can't input monitor send inputs. You can only input monitor physical inputs to the channel. And as you can see, I don't have physical inputs selected here. I have my input set to none, and I'm just routing the submix into, or I'm routing the prelim into the post lim here. Okay? So I can't use input monitoring. Otherwise, it would be very simple. What I've done instead is I've created a cycle action where I can mute all of my sources and also mute my prelim, or I can unmute all of my sources and my prelim and instead mute the active take that's printed on the post lim, right? Now, the reason I mute my sources is so that the audio doesn't go into the bus input of the post lim, and I don't get doubled up audio. The reason I'm muting my prelim has nothing to do with that. Muting the sources would be sufficient. The reason I mute my prelim is because if I don't mute my prelim when I'm done and I set it into capture playback and I go to bounce my post lim, Reaper will see that there are active plugins being bussed into the input of this post lim channel, and it'll crunch the numbers for them, even though they aren't processing any audio, and it makes my render time go through the fucking roof. Whereas if I have this muted, it shuts the DSP off for it. It knows not to calculate the limiter processing or clipper processing or both processing, and it makes the render very fast because it's basically just spitting this WAV file out into another WAV file. It's an immediate render time, which saves me a bunch of time, okay? Now, when I toggle it again, it mutes my capture, just the item, just the take for the capture, so that again, I'm not listening to my capture, I'm only listening to my sources now. All right. And that is cooked into this cycle action here that I set up. And what a cycle action is where you can set up steps where the first time you hit the button, it does one thing. And the second time you hit the button, it does another thing. You can add as many steps as you want. You can have it cycle between 3 or 4 or however many steps you want, but that's the point of cycle actions. So you can see here that when I hit the button the first time, it selects all my tracks in group 2, which are my sources, and it toggles mute for them. And then it selects all my tracks in group 3, which is prelim and post lim, and then it toggles mute for the first of those tracks, which is the prelim. Now, if I hit the button again, it selects all the tracks in group 3, and it toggles record arm for those. And then it selects the first track, which is the prelim, unmutes it, and then it selects all the tracks in group 2, which is again my sources, and it toggles mute for those. That's all there really is to it. Okay? Pretty simple. So, that's my input monitoring. Easy peasy. I also have some sneaky stuff set up for my play and stop button, my space bar, where, let me pull it up, where it does different things depending on what's going on when I hit the space bar. And this brings conditional statements into the equation. Conditional statements let you do if, then, else, and, or, whatever statements, and you can mix them up with cycle actions where you have steps and you have conditions within those steps to do different things depending on what's going on, right? So I have an if and an if not here. If, excuse me, if I hit play stop and record is not enabled, it just plays. Or if it's not actively recording and I hit the space bar, it just plays or stops. So if I'm not playing, it starts playback. And if I am playing but I'm not recording, it stops playback. Easy. But if I am recording and I hit the space bar, it selects all the tracks in group 2, mutes them, and then selects all the tracks in group 3, and it mutes the first one, which is the prelim. So basically, when I'm recording and then I hit stop, it automatically mutes my sources so that I'm now listening to my capture. Because when I'm done recording something, odds are I'm not going to want to listen to the sources anymore. I'm going to want to listen to the capture. So that just saves me the extra keystroke of doing that. It's just a little ergonomic thing that I cooked in there to save me a repetitive action that I would otherwise need to do. And let me show you what that looks like. But first, let me recall my settings for this session here. Now, I save my recall notes for most things as a marker up here. And I'll explain my nomenclature to you. MC stands for mastering controller, which is my transfer console. And then plus 5.5 means I'm turning my output gain up by 5.5 dB. And then I've got Mark 3, which means I'm using the Lavry as my A to D converter. And then I've got plus 3 soft sat, or plus 3 SS, which means I've got plus 3 dB soft saturation mode turned on in the Lavry, which engages some really gorgeous soft saturation. That's a big part of the charm of these converters. It's not just the clipping. The soft saturation is very magical and integrates with program material in a more natural way than just about any other saturation profile I've ever messed with. Okay, so I know all of my settings. If I had EQ settings dialed in, I would have that listed up there too with my shorthand that I use to recall my EQ settings. About the only thing that I can't recall in my shorthand is the Portico settings, because there's a lot of settings and most of the controls here don't have numbers, strict numbers corresponding to each step. So I use a program called Session Recall, which has basically an image of the portico, and you can adjust the settings for each control and save them as recall. So I can just refer to that and dial it back in for each session. Okay. But anyway, I've dialed in my settings here. So now when I switch from capture playback to playing back the live audio, it sounds the same. Which is how I get my settings back if I need to go back and do revisions, or if somebody wants to send a new mix through it or whatever it may be, right? So I'm going to delete this print here, and I'm going to start recording, okay? I'm just going to start recording off rip. And when I hit stop, you'll notice it mutes all my sources and it mutes my prelim. I'm now in capture playback mode. And if I hit M, it toggles back to live input, okay? So that's how it works with singles. Let's look at how this works with EPs. So here is a gorgeous EP that I just mastered for Mercury and Lavry, and it comes out this Thursday. It's called Worlds Collide, and it's a banger, and I highly recommend you buy it. And let's have a look at how this goes here. So I've got my recall for each song, which makes it easy for me to dial in the settings for the hardware for each song. But I also need to recall the plugin settings for my channel, for my limiters, for my submix, for my, pitch and catch converter choices. And I do that with snapshots. Snapshots let you recall any mixer settings that you've got going. Okay, so I hit the first one and it loads the settings for the original version of Worlds Collide. And you notice I got some plugins here. I've got limiter settings here. Now I hit Final Approach, which is this one. And you notice the plugins change on both the channel level and on the prelim. And I hit the remix. And they change again. There we go. Okay, so that's how I can save my settings for different songs across an EP in one session, right? Makes it really fast and easy to get from song to song. Between that and the recall notes for the hardware that I write down up above. All right. And let's lastly check out a stem mastering session here. This is one I did for Seth Vogt. Also gorgeous. And you see I have my plugin effects on the channel level. I have some going on like little sections of the stems, right? So that I can apply stuff granularly to just little parts of individual stems. And then I have my submix settings and I have my prelim settings and I have my recall notes up here. As you can see, I've got the Soma going on this one. All right. And let's see. I think that's pretty much everything for all of my use cases. So I hope this was enlightening and informative and maybe might even inspire the way you set up your mastering sessions if you do mastering. And yeah, thanks for joining me. If you stuck it out this long, you're a real trooper and I commend you. So take it easy. Have a good one.